this meeting to order. Welcome to the meeting number 26 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Accounts. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would like to remind participants of the following points. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. All comments should be addressed through the chair. Members, there is no members on Zoom. Good. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083G, the committee resumed consideration of the Public Accounts of Canada 2024 and the Public Accounts of Canada 2025, referred to the committee on Tuesday, December 17, 2024, and Friday, November 7th, 2025. I would like to welcome our witnesses. Thank you for coming today.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Madam Chair, just before starting the testimony of those people, with my respect to them, j'aimerais simplement déposer une motion.
I would like to table a motion about a topic that affects the Canada Revenue Agency that's outraging people. People are upset to see what Canada Revenue Agency is doing with the City of Laval. I'm going to table the following motion that in light of recent reporting indicating that Canada Revenue Agency is requiring Laval to pay $1 million to the former Mayor Gilles Vaillancourt for taxes due taken from the municipality and that were later reimbursed. The committee invite the Minister of Canada Revenue Agency as well as officials and the Mayor of Laval to appear before the committee for at least 2 hours at the first opportunity to explain the decision-making process of the agency and to clarify the position of the Liberal government to require a municipality to pay a former politician in relation to proceeds of crime. The interpreter did not have a copy of the motion. There are many questions raised by this issue. Radio-Canada published something on this morning. We need to shed light on this, and the best way to do so would be to have the minister appear and the Mayor of Laval could explain his position.
Okay, thank you. We'll need to have that in writing and in both languages. Merci. So I will begin again. Welcome. We have from the Department of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, Paul Halucha, Deputy Minister, Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, Michelle Barron, Assistant Deputy Minister and Chief Financial Officer, Corporate Management Sector, Matt de Villager. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. Okay. Assistant Deputy Minister, Strategic Policy and Integration Sector. We do not have any opening statements, so we will now proceed to rounds of questions. The first round is for 6 minutes, and we have Ms. Lewis. Good morning and welcome for the first round of 6 minutes.
And thank you for being here today. Across the country, municipalities are being encouraged to approve new housing developments, but many of these communities simply do not have the infrastructural capacity to support housing development. My riding of Haldeman Norfolk, which is a rural riding, for example, has a development in a town called Port Dover, and that has been stalled because of insufficient water capacity and wastewater capacity to support the approved housing. Does the development track how many housing units across Canada have been approved but cannot proceed because of insufficient infrastructure, such as water, wastewater, and power?
Thank you very much for the question. I don't have that actual number with me. I would say the number is high. We certainly know that it is a principal issue identified by municipalities, and that is why we are delivering the Community Housing Infrastructure Fund, which actually has as its sole objective to increase the water infrastructure to enable housing developments to move forward. And to date, we have actually done, there's 2 streams to that, one of which is a direct delivery stream that actually has allowed for 190,000 potential units to be built. So it's contributing to improving that capacity.
And I thank you very much for that honest answer, because I think it's obvious to municipalities like counties like mine that it's the federal government is encouraging municipalities and approving housing even though there is insufficient infrastructure to sustain those homes. And that causes a lot of friction within the community, because you have developers wanting to build, and then you have those saying, well, we don't even have enough infrastructure for the existing homes. So even though the government makes announcements to approve housing builds, you can't start building those homes because the supporting infrastructure just doesn't exist. Isn't it a fact that the federal government currently doesn't have any single coordinated program, even though you have these programs that you've announced? You don't have any way of coordinating and integrating housing approvals with the infrastructural requirements that are needed across the country.
So the municipal levels is obviously where housing approvals happen, right? That's where permitting takes place. I would say we do actually do a lot of coordination with both provincial governments and municipalities to understand where their housing infrastructure needs are. I mean, that's largely what we've done through these programs. Typically, we don't, municipalities won't approve new housing zone permits unless they know that the infrastructure is going to be there. So we have, as we have been running the programming, a real keen eye on where those municipalities want to build out. And there's a lot of dialogue going back and forth. And I would say, so the department largely does that sort of traffic control. We do it with CMHC, and we're now doing it with Build Canada Homes as well.
Okay, so you've stated that that something does exist. Is there a name for this coordinated program? And how does this program ensure accountability across municipalities that these funding announcements are actually translating into housing starts?
So we don't have a program name for this. I mean, this is Housing Infrastructure Communities Canada. This is part of the mandate of the department. We have a policy lead on housing, and the government has put housing and infrastructure together for exactly the reasons that you outlined. So it's sort of it's our day job. It's not just a one unit inside of the organization that looks at that.
Okay, let's turn to something which is also very important that people are very concerned about, and that's affordability in housing. The average housing cost in Canada has risen dramatically over the past decade. And for many Gen Zs and millennial Canadians, the dream of owning a home seems increasingly out of reach to them. How does this government expect the dream of owning a home to remain attainable for the next generation, especially when housing starts are so low and the supply is so low, and largely because of infrastructural funding? How does the government expect for that dream to become a reality?
So I want to just acknowledge at the outset that you're absolutely right, that it has become harder for especially younger Canadians to make the down payments. We've seen the number of weeks increase that people have to save in order to make their down payment. So 100% agree with you in terms of your assessment, your diagnosis. And I think that's been largely what has motivated investments that the government has made federally and provincial and municipal governments. Like, I think it's important to recognize it's a shared accountability across different levels of government. And so provinces have made investments, municipalities have made investments, and federal government has made extensive investments both through the housing plan that was put out most recently with Build Canada Homes, the National Housing Strategy that goes back a decade, and then obviously policy initiatives like what we've seen through targeted tax relief. GST.
And these policy initiatives, how many units does the department estimate will actually enable those infrastructural investments? How many units do you project to come out of those policies?
To just specifically on infrastructure investments?
Yes.
As I mentioned, the program that we have is the Community Housing Infrastructure Fund, and our estimates are just through the direct delivery projects that we've done, which is around 65 projects, that it's over 191,000 potential units. Most of the money went to provinces, so they are the ones who now select and determine what are the projects. So we'll know as we review the projects, approve them, how much inventory, how much potential housing they're adding in.
So there's no preset number of housing.
Thank you. That's the end of your question. Now to Ms. Tesser-Dirksen.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to our guests today. Just for some background, I'm a former municipal councillor. I was sitting around the municipal council table this time last year. So when we talk about housing, I'm bringing a pretty particular lens to things, and I am going to follow up on my colleague Ms. Lewis's line of questioning, which I think was an excellent line of questioning with respect to infrastructure. But I want to start first by addressing some criticism that Build Canada Homes has been receiving, particularly with respect to criticisms that it's just adding to a bureaucracy, that we already have programs that can do this work. And bureaucracy in this question kind of having a negative connotation. The work of catalyzing home building could be undertaken by other existing programs, is what we're hearing from some people. So I recognize that the pace of home building that the government has planned is quite unprecedented. So I want to give you a chance to tell us how you respond to that type of criticism that Build Canada Homes might be redundant or simply unnecessary at best and actually could be detrimental or wasteful at worst.
So I think, anytime you add a new function, you have to address exactly the kind of issues that you identified. So when we were tasked with developing Build Canada Homes, we looked very carefully at what was being done and not done by other organizations, and what were the criticisms. We had on the one side of our desk what were the demands from stakeholders, municipalities, developers across the country? What were they not seeing from their interactions with the Government of Canada? And the focus there was address those issues. So by definition, we started with things that weren't getting done or things that were viewed as problematic. And on the other side, there obviously wasn't, I would say entirely positive views around a lot of our organizations that we had in existing, and without any, so CMHC, Canada Lands Corporation, were viewed as having some limitations in terms of their capacity to deal with the current reality. And so putting those two together, effectively, we came to a new organization that is intended, and I think is beginning to deliver on the housing potential, on the promise of having, of delivering things more efficiently and at scale than what was occurring through either of the organizations. And that's without, as I said, without criticizing the existing actors that were there. So it is a net new, and it does fill a gap in a significant way. And I'm happy to talk about that if helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So I'm going to get back to the municipal lens here. Municipalities like mine in Milton and in Halton Hills have spent years planning for population growth. And the question I get now is, from a federal perspective, what's the most important role that Build Canada Homes can play in helping that planned growth translate into actual homes on the ground with respect to water, wastewater, and infrastructure?
So Build Canada Homes itself will not be, delivering infrastructure dollars into communities. That'll be the role of the department. It's one of the advantages of having proximity between Build Canada Homes and HICC, which is, does the infrastructure spends on behalf of the government, is it allows market intelligence around where they're investing to come over and impact the types of infrastructure projects that we do. So it's a real synergy that we will be getting over the next number of years.
Great. One specific question I had was with respect to two-tier municipalities. So where we are, the region actually owns some land. And one of the questions I got from one of my municipal regional councillors was that they want to know how the land is going to be accounted for in the contribution of the region. So typically land might be worth a third of the total development value. How does the regionally owned land figure into that value proposition? Will it be accounted for as a contribution of the region to the project, or will it have to be in addition to whatever dollars the region brings to a project?
So there's not like a hard, fast rule on that. So that's the investment policy. So you're kind of going to, how is the investment policy of Build Canada Homes set? And it is set to allow for specific decision-making to be made around specific transactions. So that would, they would allow for property coming from a regional or municipal level of government to be accounted for as BCH is considering what level of capital investment, capital allocation to make. It was designed to have a lot of flexibility, both in terms of the instruments that it has, and as well as the kind of the investment decision making that in factors that it brings to bear. So. And it plays at scale too, right? So this is, for example, like some regional government that came forward and said, we are going to put, I'm making these numbers up, but $100 million and land valued at another 100, and we're going to look at reducing property taxes, and we're going to look at reducing development charges. So Build Canada Homes would be able to say, okay, so all in the value of that contribution is X, and this is what we will bring to the table. And I think notable is they can do that much earlier in the process than previously, for example, the CMHC used to be able to do. And often, as you know, when dollars come in early on, when there's a surety of value, dollar value coming in, it brings a lot of certainty to transactions, allows other capital to be crowded in, allows certainty of planning. And so that kind of is the vision for how Build Canada Homes puts investments together. And as you noted, property values and property coming in or something that was envisioned for.
Thank you. Now, Monsieur Lemire, for 6 minutes.
Merci,
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for joining us today. The question of housing is of great concern for many Quebecers and Canadians. In 2024, CMHC funded $1.3 billion in projects, but 1.4 were not spent in 2025. So CMHC had $2.1 billion in authorizations, but only spent $1.3 billion. So that's a shortfall of $2 billion over 2 years. How do you justify that?
Can you provide a little bit more detail in terms of which programming you're talking about? Or are you just talking about overall they lapsed money?
Pour moi, c'est toute la dichotomie.
For me, it's the dichotomy between what the budget is for what they can spend and what is actually spent. Because what we see on the ground is that there are delays in responding. So there are additional costs for builders, and all of the pressure is on the shoulders of nonprofits. A project that was approved by CMHC in 2025 was supposed to have a final approval to start work in April or May, but the final approval never came. But the letter from CMHC said that if the work didn't start in June, it was going to come because CMHC didn't provide the authorizations in time. Why is CMHC taking so long to respect the timeline, and why is it not spending all of the money that was authorized for projects?
So on a specific case like that, I can't give you an answer today. We'd be glad to come back to you with answers. But in general, you lapse money because either projects are not completed, or in the case of our department, it's because we don't receive, receipts to pay, and that typically results in money lapsing. So I'm sure they, in fact, I know they work hard to spend their money on an annual basis, but I'm not aware of a lot of lapses in CMHC's funding.
Il y a plusieurs exemples, je peux.
There are a number of examples. I can provide them.
Absolument.
Chose importante.
An important thing.
For year to year. So the money may lapse in 1 year, but it typically is added to the expenditures for the year that comes up. So projects, and that's one of the advantages of Build Canada Homes versus CMHC. So CMHC has its money in program allocations on an annual basis. And so if they don't spend the money in that year, they don't get the deals are delayed. It could be as simple as permits not getting done. There's lots of things that happen at municipal levels. They are then, they have to have that money reprofiled to another fiscal year for them to be able to spend. So it's exactly the reason why for Build Canada Homes, we move them to a statutory authority. So that allows them to carry forward money from year after year and to avoid those sort of those lapses that attract a lot of questions and seem very damaging and negative, but it's often just it's a transaction cost of how the money is set up in program authorities.
Un des problèmes par rapport à ça.
One of the problems in this regard is that it looks like costs are pushed back and it's as much as what was actually spent. And problems remain. I want to give a very concrete example. A shelter for women who've suffered domestic violence in Laval. There are 7 shelters that have had problems with the disbursement of money and also the conditions that were added by CMHC at the last minute once the letters of agreement and approval were sent. CMHC is not taking into account the reality of Quebec. We're asking nonprofits to pay for a consultant to analyze work when work is already inspected. Things have to be done twice because Quebec has a different civil code. Why is CMHC not adapting its programs to the reality of Quebec? Will Build Canada Homes take that into account, or will Quebec be penalized again?
So so I mentioned when I was responding to another question how there were a lot of things we had on the table as challenges with the business model at CMHC, and so one of them is the fact that program authorities dictate what CMHC is required to necessitate by way of reporting in. Build Canada Homes, to answer your last question, doesn't have program authorities in the same way. They have a lot more flexibility, and very positively, the federal and the provincial government have actually entered into a very positive agreement about how Build Canada Homes will operate in Quebec, and the intention of that is to it creates a table where issues like this can be discussed, avoids duplication, and hopefully puts us in a situation where some of the provincial issues around M30 that can sometimes make it challenging to deliver programming are being dealt with at the outset.
There are cases where nonprofits had a funding agreement from Quebec, from the SHQ, and if they had an agreement from CMHC before a specific date, but CMHC did not respect the timeline and went beyond it, and so there are projects that didn't happen. Another example is that CMHC has problems paying builders on time, and they look at the money that's not being used in their accounts. Why is CMHC making nonprofits wait when they have to pay interest? They have to pay more, and they're not reliable. Why aren't they respecting the agreements on paper? Why are these programs reoccurring with the CMHC?
Short answer that is every time you look at one of the cases, and you see that there's issues often on both sides of the table. So CMHC tends to get often blamed for things that are beyond their control, like capital structures, like the level of risk that a not-for-profit is putting forward. So there is a lot of dynamics in putting a transaction together, and it's very hard for me to sort of answer at that level. So specific cases have specific answers.
We now move to the second round for 5 minutes each, starting with Ms. Kuzi.
Thank you. In Volume 3, Mr. Halucha, of the 2025 Public Accounts under the category of losses of public money and property, the public accounts show that your department, specifically CMHC, lost $231,840 in a single case of fraudulent claims of grants and contributions. Are you familiar with this case?
I'm not familiar, and just to clarify, CMHC is not my department.
Okay. So then you wouldn't know if any of this money has been recovered by this fraudulent claim?
I wouldn't know. I'm very glad to follow up with CMHC and if allowed, provide back that answer.
Was your department captured under the Comprehensive Expenditure Review?
Yes, the department was captured.
Okay. It was communicated that one of the ways the government would meet the CER was by reducing reliance and spending on professional services. Did your department receive instructions to cut spending on consulting?
We did. As part of the expenditure review, that was not a specific direction that we received.
Why do the main estimates propose an increase of $62 million on consulting from 2025-2026 at HICC?
So I'll answer it. So basically, we are a small department, and we have a lot of our expenditures which are temporary. And so we use consulting, especially on the IT side, in order to avoid having to make long-term take on long-term obligations by way of employees that we're not able to reduce, or we have to reduce at great cost. So it's a way of managing in uncertainty, as I would describe it.
Okay. I mean, this is something that we've seen quite continuously with the Liberal government over the last 11 years, is that they indicate they're going to spend less money on consulting, and this never is the case. We saw this with ArriveCan, for example. We saw this with the previous Treasury Board's objective to cut spending on consultants, which didn't occur. The current Prime Minister has indicated that he will try and spend less money on consultants, and yet there is this increase of $62 million. How would you explain to Canadians or I should say, how would you expect them to believe that your department will actually reduce spending, as the government has promised, if at the first opportunity to spend, you're increasing these amounts on consulting?
So we are reducing expenditures in the department, and actually the savings will be $2.9 billion over 4 years. We've reduced by approximately 190 FTEs, and so those do account for real reductions. Our consultant envelope, Michelle, can I ask you just to add on?
Yes, just to add the ratio, we've been trying to change the ratio of employees to consultants. So back in 24-25, our ratio was about 50-50, and now we're at 60-40, so 60% employees and 40% consultants. So, but we do rely on consultants for mainly research and IT as well, information technology.
Okay. So if CMHC is not under your purview, whose purview are they under, please?
So they have a CEO, they have a board of directors, and they report directly to the minister.
Okay,
Minister
so
Robertson.
there's no communication with yourself and the head of CMHC?
There is communication.
Okay, then do you not communicate about these losses at all, or what?
So I was never brought up to me the losses that were
okay. So would
identified.
this be an organization that is in tandem with you, in parallel with you? It's not under you directly.
Yes, a Crown Corporation. So CMHC is arm's length. As I mentioned, they have their own corporate board, and they have a CEO.
Okay. Are their finances, would they report to you at all, anything relative to their finances, or just do you share the same minister?
Share the same minister.
Okay,
yeah,
then how does the minister coordinate your activities?
Well, there's we have a portfolio affairs group that manages things like appointments, the approvals of corporate plans, that does that sort of corporate governance oversight on behalf of the government. But from a policy perspective, we're engaged with CMHC pretty regularly in terms of their programs. Obviously, they have a commercial book as well. That's not led out of our department at all. That's led out of the Department of Finance. So I should note, actually, on their commercial book, they report to the Minister of Finance, and on their programs, they report to Minister Robertson.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Osborne for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to get back to Build Canada Homes for a moment, and I understand the concept of Build Canada Homes is to reduce duplication, sort of become a one-stop shop. Connecting all levels of government, including Indigenous government, community organizations, developers, nonprofits, for example. Can you explain how that works? Is there a registry? How does it reduce red tape? How does it expedite the construction of homes?
So Build Canada Homes does have I wouldn't call it a registry, but there is a portal that allows for applicants to bring forward project proposals. And these applicants are not-for-profits. They are developers. They are municipalities, their provincial governments, all coming with project proposals that they're looking for funding support on. The way they proceed is to, like, what they're trying to do as a focus is get portfolio deals done at the provincial level and with large municipalities. And I would say the way that your question specifically on how do they assist in projects going forward is by being able to come to quicker decisions and come in with capital earlier in the sort of, in the formation of those portfolios. So they are able to come in earlier and invest earlier, which then allows other capital to get crowded in.
Okay. In terms of provinces and municipalities, can you talk about what MOUs you may have entered into at this stage, and what that means in terms of construction timelines for construction, numbers of units?
Well, there's a whole series of different memorandum of understanding and actually deals that have been put together. So I can just run through. So there are 6 direct build sites that I think everyone knows about that were announced in September. They've signed an agreement with the City of Ottawa. They have signed term sheets with Nova Scotia. Nunavut, there was an agreement in principle that was announced in January. We're very close to having a contribution agreement with that territory. There is an MOU in January with Quebec and British Columbia more recently. And then there are other provinces that have not yet kind of gone to the MOU stage where discussions are happening right now. So they're kind of proceeding across the country.
I know we just announced funding, for example, for a treatment facility for a sewage treatment in St. John's. One of the bottlenecks for large-scale development in that region was the capacity to treat water to standard. Can you talk about what infrastructure investments, first of all, how Build Canada Homes would invest in infrastructure for municipalities, and how that will help in terms of future growth where some municipalities or regions may need that infrastructure investment in order to proceed for future development?
So just to clarify, so Build Canada Homes won't be making direct infrastructure investments. So their money will all be focused on growing the amount of affordable housing in Canada and spurring the use of modern methods of construction. So they're not at the infrastructure stage. So the infrastructure builds are done by HICC as a department, and as I mentioned, the Community Housing Infrastructure Fund it's a $6 billion investment in housing, in water treatment, water infrastructure. That was the asset class that it invested on, with a real focus on getting getting housing built, and so as a precondition to that. The second, we've now got a new fund that was announced, the Build Canada Strong Fund, in the last budget, and obviously that will continue the investments that are being made in housing infrastructure. I would say that one of the advantages of Build Canada Homes and the department being in the same portfolio to the previous question is the ability to share market intelligence. So I'll give you an example. There was one of the direct build sites is in Arbo in Toronto. That development could not move forward for a long time, and everybody knew and knows how much housing potential there is in Toronto at Downsview without a infrastructure investment in water and wastewater. And so we worked. We knew we wanted to develop the housing. We knew that BCH was going to be a player there. So we actually, through an MOU last February and then a contribution agreement this summer, we came to an agreement with the City of Toronto to cost share a major piece of infrastructure there to unlock that housing. We've done the same thing in Montreal. We've done the same thing in a number of other across the country. So it's that matching that market intelligence around where communities want to build with the infrastructure funding, and then the housing dollars coming in behind it is kind of the mixture.
Thank you. Monsieur Lemire pour 2 minutes.
Mr. Lemire for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. The problems with housing in Quebec are dire today, and that's because the federal government has agreements, but money is never paid out, or it takes a number of years. In 2017, there was a significant fund. Ontario got its money right away. Quebec, it took until 2019 to have an agreement, and so the costs during COVID means a lot more was built in Ontario than Quebec. So the agreement on housing was signed 2 years after the agreement for the Green and Inclusive Building Fund. Quebec only received $5 million out of the 109 of the program, according to the public accounts. According to Radio-Canada, Quebec received $0 from the Canada Transportation Fund to date, and Ontario had received $2 billion, over half of the money. So why, when we talk about the amounts to invest in Ontario, the programs seem to be designed to be paid quickly, and in Quebec, it's always complicated? Is that a type of discrimination against Quebec?
C'est absolument pas une forme de...
It's absolutely not a form of discrimination.
Provincial governments, the negotiations are done, independently. We strive to get deals in place with every province and territory as quickly as we can. I'll talk in a second about some of the investments that have been made under the our transit fund. But like, for example, the Community Housing Infrastructure Fund, we just completed an agreement with Quebec about a month ago. And it was a negotiation that took a bit of time. Both parties need to be ready to undertake the negotiations, and that's, they weren't the last, though. I would just say Quebec was not the last province to get an agreement with us. There's still one outstanding. On Quebec, on the CPTF, I'll just give you a few data points. So there's an active transportation fund. We approved 92 projects for $90 million with Quebec. There's a rapid transit fund. We approved 24 projects for $13.4 million. And under the Zero Emissions Transit Fund, 11 projects for $400 million.
C'est que les résultats sont pas là.
But the results aren't there, and Quebec is 23% of the population. There's a shortfall, there's inflation. When it takes 2 years longer, there's an impact on what can be built in Quebec. And when transfer payments that Quebec received $600 million out of the $11 billion spent, once again, Quebec is losing out. My time is up.
Thank you. Monsieur Detel pour 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, hello. Welcome to the witnesses, to the Parliamentary Committee. Thank you for the services you provide to Canadians. Of course, it might not be the main issue, but for millions of Canadians, it is the main issue: housing. The cost of houses. I bought my house 35 years ago, and I am privileged to have done so. My children were able to buy homes, and we were fortunate. But I'm thinking of my grandchildren and those who come to meet with us in our writing offices. I know it's true for all of us. There's no political stripe here. It's the main issue for young people. And that's why we need to take action efficiently. My questions will be about this. How is it that we had to create another structure, Build Canada Homes, and I'd like to have some numbers from you. How many public servants work at the department to help people afford homes? I'll ask more questions, but first, can you tell me how many public servants are currently working in your department on home ownership, and how many more will be hired with Build Canada Homes?
We have about, I would say, probably 175 to 200 employees in the department that work on housing policy. Most of them work on homelessness. That is our principal programming that we deliver. The department doesn't actually deliver any housing program directly, so it's important. Lots of homelessness programming. We are the principal delivery agent for homelessness programming.
Pourquoi il a fallu créer Maison Canada?
Why was it necessary to create Build Canada Homes? Why was it necessary to create Build Canada Homes? We can recognize there's one less word, but why create Build Canada Homes? Why did the government do so?
To advance affordable housing and spur the uptake in modern methods of construction. It was also designed to not be part of the department. So right now, so in the long term. So we obviously put it in the department to incubate it, to develop it, to get it going quickly, which it has been very successful, I would argue. But the intention is for it to be arm's length, for it to be, and there's legislation in the House of Commons, as you know, intended to do that.
Je relève le mot que vous avez bien.
You talked about the intention. I understand that there's nobody who gets up in the morning to make things harder for people. They're there to help people. But the best way to help people buy a home, the government campaigned on talking about Build Canada Homes. Now we see the structure exists, but we're still waiting for the results. And that's what people have a hard time appreciating, the work done here in Ottawa. When will there be concrete results to have real houses built with real families who can live in them at a reasonable price across Canada?
So there are the direct build sites that I know the committee has looked at before. This is on the 6 sites across the country. The intention is for those sites to be completed and the homes to be built by next year. And this is starting from, in some cases, some infrastructure that needs to get undertaken. On their financing, because that's principally what Build Canada Homes is set up to do, is to finance. They have already, I believe, got an inventory of around 11,000, homes that will be supported through the investments that they have announced to date. And more to come on that one. They are it's growing every month, the commitments that the government is making through Build Canada Homes. Third, I would just note that the Budget Implementation Act includes a very important aspect to enable Build Canada Homes, which is the statutory authority. So the ability for BCH to actually spend is linked to that statutory authority being approved. So effectively, that's partly what you're seeing now. Is you're seeing promissory notes, deals, intent to do deals that are getting built up, and then once the dollars are available, they will be able to do a drawdown request in the same way that the Canada Infrastructure Bank does to obtain access to the money.
Comme le disait un humoriste,
As a comedian said, we'll believe it when we see it. For now, we're waiting. Now, CMHC. You talked about a few elements earlier, and for many people who work in construction, it's one more step to get through. So what is the role of CMHC versus Build Canada Homes? Why have Build Canada Homes when we already had CMHC?
Answer.
So CMHC obviously has instruments on the insurance side that Build Canada Homes will not have. So as a insurance provider, which is a major role that CMHC plays, they will continue there, and they will be principally market focused in their intervention. So the apartment loan construction program, which is their major program, is principally a market program, whereas Build Canada Homes will play on the non-market side. So that's the division that the government envisions.
Thank you. Mr. McKinnon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to carry on with affordability, as Mr. Deltel has started. So what do we mean by affordability when we're talking about homes?
So it's on one hand, a super simple question to answer, and another one, a complicated one. So it obviously means, so there's a concept in housing policy called core housing need, which says you're in a house that you can afford when your payments are less than 30% of your monthly or your every 2-week paychecks, that you have enough money that you can pay for major repairs. So there's those kind of elements are obviously very critical to determining whether a house is affordable. At the same time, that's obviously very linked to income levels, and so it's also true to say that every home is affordable to somebody, because there will be somebody who has the income to enter into those transactions, which is why it's important to recognize that there's a strong market for housing. And I think even if Build Canada Homes with its focus succeeds fully, which we intend for it to do, there will still be 95% of the market that will be driven by market transactions around what is available at very different income levels. And that's what we've seen is a lot of mismatches in the last while. So we've seen mismatches in obviously in the condo markets in certain jurisdictions, and we've seen a major increase in the cost of housing construction, especially since the pandemic, and a discrepancy between the rate at which home prices have gone up and people's incomes have gone up. And I think that when most people think about affordability, it's that gap that they would focus on.
So how have the stakeholders, such as provinces, municipalities, and community organizations, how do they respond to this definition, if you will, of affordability?
Federal government has, what we've adopted through Build Canada Homes is a 30% of below median market rent as our definition of what will be affordable housing, and that's largely been accepted and been very positively viewed by stakeholders. There's still, I think, some unhappiness that there's still different definitions of affordability, because we have programs that were designed years ago that had different definitions, and so I know there is frustration still, and I think we will be, as we move forward and we do new programs, new initiatives, we will be using a single metric, which is the one I just mentioned.
Okay. So how will BCH ensure that the housing that is being built is in fact affordable, and that it is accessible to Canadians in most need?
Well, it will be by making units available at those different levels of affordability. I think that will be the key way that we'll achieve it. I mean, the non-market housing challenges in Canada are really linked to supply, right? If you look at Canada's, the amount of supply of non-market housing we have here, it's about 3.5%. It's 7% in a lot of, and higher in a lot of the other OECD countries that we benchmark ourselves against around a large range of socioeconomic indicators, and so that is the focus, is around increasing that amount over time and growing that market stock, and that will allow people who are going to have lower levels of income, and we're always going to have some degree of stratification in our society, to be able to find places to live.
Can you clarify what we mean by non-market housing versus market housing?
Well, I would say so. Market housing is simply people charge whatever rate price that they want, and the market does its magic, and there's a seller at some point. And I think that's served Canadians extraordinarily well. Like we believe firmly in market, the market and the role that the market plays in the provision of housing. It's simply that at the level of affordability, it's not producing enough, and there's strong evidence that absent government intervention, it never will. We've seen as governments have reduced spending in housing, which they did for probably 20 years, that amount, the level of non-market housing actually dropped. So there's a direct correlation. So I would say that's the distinction. But we do believe very strongly in the role the market plays.
Thank you. For the next round, Mr. Stevenson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to go off on. First, I've got a bunch of questions, but I'll start with some of the things you'd said earlier. Can you tell me, is there an MOU with Alberta?
Sorry, an MOU with Alberta?
Yes.
With Build Canada Homes, or with?
Yeah, you're talking about how you had certain provinces.
So one has not been announced at this point.
And can you tell me, has the Housing and Infrastructure Canada made any specific measures on federal housing programs that would reflect a higher per unit cost in rural areas and remote builds when economies of scale just don't exist in the servicing sites and delivering materials and getting the builders in those areas that it just drives up the costs. Is there anything specific to rural?
Absolutely. So we have rural programming targets in almost all of our programming, and I'd be glad to run through results if it's helpful to you.
I guess it's not so much results as looking at this point as what's the programming to get them into it, not what's done.
Okay.
My specific issue at this point is my riding's Yellowhead. I had Jasper. I had fires. They were destroyed a third of the town, 300 units. They have now got up to maybe 20% of actually under construction. And there was a big announcement on Thursday that they were going to spend $14 million. Now, it said federal, and now I'm not exactly sure if that was under your department specifically, because it was announced by the Minister of Emergency Preparedness. Now,
we have made investments in Jasper.
You have, but can you elaborate on that? Because whether you're talking about the separate from the $14 million that they just announced on Thursday that they're going to do, and it goes to your affordability that we just talked about with non-market housing. But is it specific on that end of it to non-market, or is it how are you going on the other investments that you say that have gone there?
Well, if I can be helpful, we can get back to you in the committee with details on Jasper, but I'll give you just a couple of examples. So, for example, under the National Housing Strategy overall, communities under 30,000 were identified, and there's rural streams. Under our ISIP program, there's rural streams. We've established in almost every program, and I've got a list of here about 10 or 12 of them, where there were specific carve-outs to make sure that that we were sharing resources. We take a very strong look at the regional allocation of the money, and so rural is a really key component to the department.
Tell me, how are those decisions being made, and where and how are those decisions being made as to allocations?
So the way our programming works is municipality.
Typically, what can go to rural versus the big cities?
Well, so normally we have it averages between usually 10 to 20%. We have carve-outs for rural, depending on different programs and programmatic streams. And their application, usually there's either one or two things. They're either application-based, in which case municipalities tell us what they want us to spend the money on and where they want us as a partner, and then that forms the opportunities. Ministers make decisions, but ministers make decisions based on those applications. In other cases, we have federal, provincial agreements in place. So, for example, with Alberta, if we strike an agreement on a provincial, they then select what are the project priorities. They come forward for a minister again to make an allocation.
I'm not
decision.
sure if you're aware, but last year there was a very public disagreement in priorities between the town of Jasper and the province, but yet on Thursday they did both chip in for some money on millions of dollars to that 80 units that they're putting in there. So I'm just wondering, how are we making these decisions, and what collaboration is there between?
Yeah.
How are they determining how they're going to collaborate on different projects with the municipalities? You kind of made it sound like it's pretty much up to the minister
so ministers have discretion. The minister gets to make a determination on what projects. But we work off of, as I said, in the case of direct delivery projects, we work off of submissions that come forward from First Nations communities, from municipalities, from some cases not-for-profits at the local level. Those are typically the proponents of projects that come forward. And in the case of federal provincial agreements, the provinces tell us what they essentially provide us with a menu or a set of projects that are their priorities, and then yes, ministers from both from federal and provincial government need to agree on what those allocations are.
And specifically back to Jasper, how is your interaction with Parks Canada related to the housing within parks? Because they have a lot of extra requirements to fit within the national parks.
A quick answer.
Yeah, so we don't spend money in other federal assets. So we would not have put money into Parks Canada for housing. They would not be a proponent under our programming.
Thank you. And for 5 minutes, Ms. Tesser-Dirksen, but I'll just take some of your time to ask a question following on Mr. Stevenson's comments on coordination between governments. Is there anything else that BCH can do in terms of coordinating between different levels of government to streamline approvals and reduce red tape?
So I would say that our principal avenue to do that is through the Housing Accelerator Fund, which, I mean, that's what it is. We're paying money to municipalities for improvements in their permitting systems, right? A lot of digitization has taken place. So I think that's where I would say is the focus of that activity. I think what Build Canada Homes can do is through their investments, show where the markets are that are well aligned to growth. I mean, they've got 3 KPIs, right? It's adding supply, it's adding affordable supply, and it's spurring this industrial revolution that we want to see in the home building sector. And all 3 of those, as they make market investments, they need to be assessing how good are those municipalities as partners. And so I think as they start to put dots on a map of where they're doing investments, it'll send a very strong signal about where they view as municipalities and jurisdictions that have their act in order to grow housing. If I can be blunt. So I think that market shaping role, they're going to both shape the market, and I think they're going to reveal where the strongest players are across the country.
Thank you. Ms. Tesser-Dirksen, over to you.
Thanks very much. Just to follow up on a point that many of my colleagues have talked about, affordability. It truly is something that affects, I think, all of us, definitely in our communities, some of us in our homes. I have 4 young adult children who are going through the experience of trying to analyze when or if they'll be able to own a home. So this is really something that speaks to a lot of us personally as well. I want to touch a little bit about the recurring theme of partnerships that keeps coming up, and partnerships are something that they seem baked into the Build Canada Homes model. Could you walk us through the request for qualifications process? And I'm particularly interested in knowing how you, for lack of a better word, vet the private sector partners.
So again, that's a big question. So first off, on the request for qualification, which is a process that has been launched between Build Canada Homes and PSPC, and the objective there was really to sort of create a baseline across the country of who the companies are that are doing modern methods of construction, from modular companies to panelized, companies that do panelization, to others that are, provide different parts of that supply chain. We've never, now that we're in the space where we're doing procurement, it made a lot of sense to get to know who was in the ecosystem and to better understand them, both from just you need to know who you're doing business with, as you pointed out, and secondly, to create the next step will be to create a list that could be more trusted, like the trusted suppliers in this space. So we view those 2 measures as this one is sort of the fact finding, and then the second one will be, okay, let's lock in on who has capacity to help scale, who has capacity to partner, to be a real partner for Build Canada Homes, and other parts of the federal government. Like on defense, there's an awful lot of homes being built by the Department of National Defense. We want them to also be, drawing on those same companies as they enter into agreements. So that's the answer, kind of around that procurement. The second question around kind of validation of vendors. So this will be, this will be what happens at the investment committee at Build Canada Homes. Usually when you're making an investment with a party, at least I would say 1/3 of the transaction, and I'd spent a lot of my career doing industrial policy, is who are you doing business with, and do you trust them? Do you know them well enough? What is their track record? What is the management acumen? I mean, you're basically entering into a deal with another management team. You're allocating capital towards them. And so that will be, I think, a key part of the due diligence process that will happen in that investment committee. And it's, and that gets done, there's obviously legal agreements that provide you some level of protections, but you want to make sure that you're investing with organizations, especially where you're committing public capital, that absolutely what their capabilities are and that they can do what they're signing up to do with you. So track records are very important in that, to those decisions.
Thank you. Now, Monsieur Lemieux, pour 2 minutes.
Mr. Lemieux, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to pick up on what my colleague Stevenson was saying. I have the impression that rural regions, remote areas like Abitibi-Témiscamingue, aren't getting their fair share of programs for infrastructure and housing. Programs are built for big cities. People are proud to announce things in big cities, but rural areas that have huge needs, Abitibi-Témiscamingue has a labor shortage and has for 20 years. We've experienced it for 20 years. There's an impact. Buying a home in Abitibi-Témiscamingue or renting is just about as expensive as in a big city. We also have fly-in, fly-out because people can no longer live in Rouyn-Noranda. They prefer to have their home elsewhere and fly in and fly out. That has huge consequences, but Abitibi-Témiscamingue, with its mines and natural resources, provides about 2% of Canada's GDP. Last year, with the Canada Infrastructure Bank, no money was invested in Abitibi-Témiscamingue, $0. Why are you not present in the regions of Quebec, especially Abitibi-Témiscamingue?
Merci beaucoup pour la.
Thank you very much for the question.
I would be very glad to do a return to the committee, bring back information about Abitibi-Témiscamingue and give you a picture of what investments we have done there. And for CMHC, Build Canada Homes, which won't have done anything yet, but also the department. So I will, NCIB, we'll undertake to do that and bring it back. Second, so we do invest in rural areas of the country, as I've noted. It's a priority under, I think, as every program that I've been able to find, we have a rural stream. So those decisions, so it is part of the decision making, and it is intentional to put resources into rural infrastructure. But I think your point that I can't dispute is that there is a greater need for rural infrastructure than funding that we have available, and that I would say absolutely is the case. One more thing I would just raise is under our new program, the Build Canada Strong Fund, we actually have created an opportunity for regionally significant projects to be referred to us from the major projects office. So this is a new asset. It's not really an asset class, but it's a new vehicle for us to get a regionally significant infrastructure identified. So to us for funding. So for example, obviously Abitibi-Témiscamingue is well known for its mining sector and resource capacity. So we have an ability there through the major projects office to make investments in light of the economic growth opportunities in that area. And I expect that when we haven't done anything solid as a result of that linkage yet, but we are starting to talk with the major projects office around the housing needs where you've got large investments coming in. So I won't divulge specifics here, but there's one in the prairies. It's a major mining need. They're going to be bringing in thousands of workers. Those workers are going to need homes. So we have on our docket, how do we help support through our programming the enabling infrastructure for, because those will be market homes, they won't be affordable housing, but extremely important for that investment to go forward and to be successful. So I think that's a kind of connecting the dots between an economic opportunity, the housing enabling infrastructure, and then the housing that needs to get built, and what our role is. And so, if there are market intelligence opportunities from Abitibi that you would want us to know, I'd be very, very glad to hear those from you as well.
Est-ce que vous me permettez, Présidente, simplement de demander qu'on puisse avoir une...
Could we have a breakdown of the costs of the Canada Infrastructure Bank by province and by administrative region of Quebec since its creation? I think that would be very useful, because whether it's in the buffer zone or we don't have any funding for any abattoirs and it will be funded for halal or for kosher meat, and regarding arena infrastructure, the federal government is generally absent. I'd like to have that data broken down by region. Thank you.
Ms. Lewis, for 5 minutes.
The Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund was announced in Budget 2024, but the public accounts show that there's little or no spending that occurred during the 2024 fiscal year. And we know that it was operationalized through the BIA, so there's no excuse for that. And when we have municipalities like Haldeman Norfolk who are facing immediate infrastructure challenges and constraints that are blocking housing construction, we have to ask the question, why did it take so long, more than a year, for this fund to get up and running?
I would respectfully disagree that that we're kind of behind on CHIF. We actually, that money has now, other than one province, which we are working very hard to get an agreement with, we have agreements with all of the provinces and territories across the country. And we, as I mentioned, have put out 27 projects worth $780 million through direct delivery. What you're seeing in the public accounts is the natural lag that happens on infrastructure. So we commit the money, which we have done, and then the money gets spent, and then receipts come in, and then we pay the receipts. So it shows up in our cash flow at the point where we are paying remittances. So if you do see, if you look at our at our expenditures for next year, for example, we are showing that about 5.7 billion of the ISET program is going to be funded. And that was obviously a program that came around in 2017, 2018. The allocation decisions were made a long time ago. It's simply the lag between when the work gets done and then they send us the bills and then we pay the bills. So that's what you're saying.
Okay, so since the Housing Infrastructure Fund was introduced 2 years ago, how much water and wastewater infrastructure has been built?
So I'm sure some of it has started. But what hasn't happened yet is they have not remitted payment requests to the federal government at this point. But some of the projects will certainly have begun. I think we're expecting a small amount next year to be paid out, and then they'll increase as projects get built. But it takes time between when a project gets approved and when the project starts building.
Okay, so since you know that some of them has started, how many housing units have actually started?
Well, I would guess that probably there are no housing units because this is to build the basic infrastructure. So until the infrastructure is done, it's enabling, right? That's what CHIF does. It enables housing. So the housing will come afterwards. The dividend will come after.
Okay, great. So
Just
do
like
you
it's
know,
happening.
is there a measurement? Say, for example, X kilometers of pipes will build X number of housings. Do you have a measurement of what you're spending versus
absolutely.
the outcome?
Yeah, absolutely, we do. And so we're like our KPI on that program is going to be the potential units, right? I can't, just because we put in housing infrastructure does not mean that somebody will build houses there. That permitting will get done. I mean, there's a lot that goes into those decisions, right? But we do know that absent that housing infrastructure, there's nothing is going to get built there. So there is a strong relationship between the two, and we work in close relationship with municipalities. They tell us where they're going to expand. They know where their subdivisions are. They know where they want to build housing in their communities, and so we don't tell them where they're going to build. They come forward with those projects, and those projects then become what we fund, either directly or through provincial agreements.
Okay, so you fund and do you follow up to make sure that your targets are being met? Do you have a mechanism for doing that?
Yeah, so this is so there were a couple questions about consultants and reporting, but this is what reports are. So we require reporting on all of the projects that we fund, both to ensure that expenditures are wisely used, that we're getting, we're using taxpayers' dollars wisely, and we're getting value for money, but also around on the reporting side to tell us what we've gotten for the money. Exactly.
So we've heard about the home ownership slipping away for Gen Z and millennial Canadians. Has the department done any analysis on infrastructure shortages and the barriers for especially that generation in owning a home because of construction?
I can't think of on the infrastructure side. I might turn to Matt. He has avoided having to speak at this committee so far. But we did a national housing infrastructure study that just came out in the fall. Matt, anything you want to specify there?
Yeah, so there's an infrastructure council that supports the minister. It's at arm's length, and they put out a first report assessing very much housing enabling infrastructure and the extent to which that creates barriers in this country to getting the kind of supply built. And they've looked not only nationally with the data we've got from StatsCan, but regionally, really drilling into where the bigger barriers are. So that goes into it. And I would say to your question that construction costs are a part of it, but other things that this committee and others have looked at around, development charges and how those have grown and the role that those play, all of those come into the housing ecosystem, especially the regulatory pieces that are with provinces and territories. So the combination of those for the housing system are adding the burden to young homeowners and those wanting to get into the homeowning space.
So is there any plan within the department to bridge that gap between the loss of the dream for Gen Zs and millennials of owning a home because of the shortages of home and the inflated price of homes that we've seen over the last decade?
A short answer, please.
That's not fair. That was hard. That was a big question. I would say that it's at the core of everything that we're doing is to improve housing supply. That's everybody in the department. Either we have a lot of young people and we have a lot of people who have kids, who have grandkids, who are also struggling in this market. And so I would say that it's at the core of what motivates us on housing policy.
Thank you. You can always answer your question through another member here. Mr. Osborne, please go ahead for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to talk about a couple of different directions, I guess. One of them is there are many different types of housing needs. Mixed income, middle income. Hopefully, middle income won't be left out of the mix here because I know that that's a challenge for middle income families as well. Student to senior housing, transitional housing. How does Build Canada Homes plan to prioritize? And I know that it may be jurisdictional as well or based on location. But how do you plan to prioritize based on the projects that come in?
Really a question. So the investment policy is our public answer to that question, right? It lays out what are the KPIs that the organization will assess as it reviews applications. What is it trying to incentivize? How is it measuring success in terms of the allocation of its own dollars? And as I mentioned, there's a good argument that all supply is good supply, and I tend to agree with that. And so Build Canada Homes will be has some overall supply increase as one of its top 3 KPIs. It's not going to simply so affordability is the second one, and I've talked a lot about affordability, but it won't be we're not going to be doing interventions. They won't be that in the market building non-market housing in isolated areas. That's been an experiment that happened in the 1960s and 70s. It wasn't very successful. So your point about mixed income homes and apartments is key. We're going to be doing a percentage of these properties and investments will be non-market, and then there will be a lot that will be market. So even in the 6,000 direct builds, not every home in that place will be strictly affordable, because when you bring in market actors, then you bring in capital and you lower the costs, right? It's a key part of making developments go forward. And the third one I would say is, and probably the one we haven't talked a lot about today is around modern methods of construction, which is our best bet to reduce the costs of home ownership over time. And it's and what Build Canada Homes is going to do is be a demand signal. It's not modular and modern methods of construction by default, but the intention is to have that be a really major part of their portfolio in order to spur that industry, because that is a key industry for us to bring the kind of supply, affordable supply, to the market that we're going to need in order to deal with the housing challenge long term. From my perspective, and I've studied this for a number of years, I do not see another avenue to deal with the housing crisis except through getting the cost of construction back down and raising people's salaries through. Right, I think that's the other. That's a really key part, is actually having our standard of living as Canadians improve, our purchasing power improve. That's a key avenue to enabling people to purchase homes as well.
I mean, supply and demand plays a large part in this, and you mentioned that. So getting homes built will increase supply. Lowering demand, lowering costs. We hope that formula works. But how do you balance the important goals of affordability, the speed of delivery, and encouraging? You've spoken 2 or 3 times today already about innovative housing solutions.
Well, luckily, I don't think you need to balance them, because I think they all push in the same direction, right? We need affordable housing, and we want to deploy capital in a way that maximizes the return. And a really strong way to do that is to help build up help to build the modern methods of construction sector. Improve the demand there, so that that becomes because they are more affordable. Like the costs, you see different modeling results, but it's 20 to 30% less waste. They're faster in terms of their ability, the speed at which projects can be done. You obviously can build off-site, so you can build 12 months a year, versus in Canada often where you can't build for many of those months. So there's lots of advantages that are simply built into that model. I think that one of the challenges is going to be acceptance by Canadians, kind of as they see this deployed more frequently across the country. I think. And I think that's going to be, I don't know if it's going to be a challenge, but we saw this on zero emissions vehicles, right? For a number of years, there was just not a familiarity with the product, and that led to, I think, reticence to purchase. Now, I think people are on the other side of that. I think the same thing's going to happen with modular homes, because they're not just and off-site construction, because they're not just cheaper. They're actually in many cases better, because you've got some uniformity to the product standards that exists on that type of product. So a lot of positives, and I think a lot pulling in the same direction. And what Build Canada Homes tries to do is bring all of those together. And so, I think the investment policy is the guidance in terms of how they're going to make these decisions, but it's really the investment committee and the deployment of capital that will tell the story of how they've managed this.
Thank you. There is one more round left. I am planning to end the meeting at 1 p.m. The Conservatives have given their 5-minute time to Monsieur Lemire.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci au Conseil.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the Conservatives. Mr. Alucha, in the Public Accounts of 2025, on page 385 in the French version, 386, CMHC has over $2 billion for housing, but it only spent $1.3 billion. When we look at the same page for the financial statements, there's $500 million that weren't spent in 2025 for different programs. So in total, your department portfolio didn't spend in 2025 $2 billion in infrastructure and housing. In my first round, I raised this, and I want to give you the time to properly respond. Why wasn't that money spent? It's not that the needs aren't there on the ground.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the reason why it's challenging to we have a prediction challenge, I would say, every year in terms of how much money we're going to spend, because we are based on how much receipts we receive, right? So, for example, we are in the month of March right now. We're probably going to do about 35 to 40% of our expenditures for the year. We will know between now and the early part of April how much money we're actually spending. So good news is our lapse as a department has reduced significantly. Last year we lapsed $2.5 billion. This year we are expected to lapse under $500 million. So we're actually using predictive modeling to improve to predict. But there are some major projects, for example, in transit that we don't know when they're going to begin to send us requests for payment. If they happen this year, and we've booked some of them in, which is why we're expecting to have about a $10 billion in cash flow this year versus about $7 billion last year. But we won't know until probably January, February of next year the extent to which we are getting those requests have come forward. So it goes back to the point I made around programs. So program money, you have to show the money in a certain year. If you don't spend it that year, then we go through reprofile requests to move the money to future years. So it's not lost. It's not serving the need. It's simply an accounting treatment kind of below the surface around when the money shows up in the public accounts. And we do our best to predict it, but we don't control it, is kind of the key message that I would give. And again, going back to Build Canada Homes, it's why that statutory authority works so well. So CIB, you will note, doesn't lapse anything. So CIB doesn't lapse anything because CIB has a statutory allocation of money. If they don't spend the money this year, then it stays in their statutory envelope and they use it next year. So it's for infrastructure, it's probably it's a much better way to account for the dollars, and it's why we've done that for Build Canada Homes, to give them that same kind of capacity.
Est-ce que j'imagine vous allez...
I imagine you'll say the same thing when we see that there's a decrease in money spent on infrastructure between 2004 and 2005. This is a decrease of $300 million. Oof. So $300 million less were spent between 2024 and 2025. Housing and infrastructure should be the political priority of the government for 2 or 3 years. It's become a priority in the House of Commons. What we see in the numbers is that there's less and less money being spent. Is it because the authorization delays of CMHC are too long? When I'm on the ground, that's what I'm told. There are surprises that come up. The efficiency of an energy efficiency program, that's a major problem. Quebec's housing codes aren't recognized. There are additional delays, and that's like the Emerald shelter in Abitibi-Témiscamingue. When construction had started, there needed to be another authorization to show that the site complied to environmental standards. Why didn't that happen before? This adds time and costs, and there's pressure on organizations that are managing this. So I think you have a responsibility in this regard. Why are we at this point? Why is the money not being spent? Are regions taken into account how far north they are? Maybe there are more constraints and there's more bureaucracy and projects aren't established in the regions. I'll respond in 2 parts.
On the infrastructure side, I think you have it exactly right. So I'm looking at our grants and contribution flows by fund category, and so what you have is you have a positive tendance. It's in 2022-23 we spent $4.3 billion. It went up to $4.9 billion. Then it went up to $5.3. Then it went up to $6.2, and now it's going up to $7.5. So as projects are moving forward, we have a much more clarity in terms of how much they're spending every year, and we are spending more. Your question, but I think your second point around delays at CMHC is, I think, really a question probably best answered by them. But I would say that there's, so you need to, these are due diligence projects. They have underwriters that have to say that that the risk is warranted for the expenditure of public funds. They have program criteria they need to meet. There's reporting requirements. Like there's a lot that weighs on CMHC as they're making decisions that can sometimes push them from one year to the next. There's also things like interest rates. So often a proponent will wait for an interest rate change, or they'll want to, they might have, their cost of capital might have gone up. There's a lot of things that affect specific transaction that I think often just get pinned on kind of CMHC as delays on their part, and I'm sure there are some delays on their part.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Mr. McKinnon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to switch at this point to homelessness. So I understand that Reaching Home is being renewed, and I guess I'd like you to speak a little bit about the successes of the program in the past and how we are going to continue to build on those to continue supporting Canadians experiencing homelessness.
Okay, thank you very much. So very pleased to do so. So Reaching Home, has invested about $1.16 billion since 2019 to support about 3,500 projects across the country. That has helped more than 40,000 people to achieve more stable housing in just the last 2 years. It invests about $700 million a year through a network of municipal not-for-profits across the country that are really the front line in working with homeless people to provide supportive and transitional housing. So it's a really key part of the government, the key part of the Government of Canada's contribution to what is a national problem. Obviously, I would, again, in keeping with my past comments, want to underline the role that provinces play, municipalities, not-for-profits, a lot of obviously philanthropy that takes place to support this across the country. So but it is our major flagship. In addition, we have a veterans homelessness initiative as well, which is into its second year now and showing very positive results. And this was, I think this committee and others along the way have noted the significant challenges that our veterans were facing. And this is a program was designed to specifically deal with them. And to help meet their need. We do that in close contact with the Veterans Department as well.
So one of the keys I understand around dealing with homelessness is that the homeless people have a requirement to have wraparound support from the provinces and the mental health and so forth. Does Reaching Home, how does Reaching Home facilitate working with the provinces to make that happen?
Well, again, I would point to that network of partnerships. So it's working. Provincial governments obviously do provide significant resources as well. If you look at many of the provincial accounts, actually, they now have partnerships with Reaching Home, with the federal government. Reaching Home as a key aspect of the delivery mechanism. So it's undertaken in partnership with those groups and through a significant number of agreements directly with providers at the local level.
Okay, thank you. I want to speak to a few of the points that Mr. Lemire made. So the fact that you've allocated a certain amount of money on different projects is not an absolute requirement that you spend that money in a given year. It's available to be spent, but it requires the application of different projects to be made and approved and so forth. So the fact that you may or may not have spent exactly that amount of money is not a deficiency of the department. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. As I noted, there's any number of things that can make it more complicated to deliver an infrastructure project than is envisioned at the point where commitment of resources is made, usually by the federal government, province, municipality, including things like manpower, getting the people to the site, so that can cause delays. They can be supply chain issues, like kind of all the things we have heard that the private sector has been challenged on since the pandemic, and the delays. They play out in projects as well. So we see projects getting descoped. We see projects that are being substituted out. So one of the things our framework agreements allow for is we allocate money to a provincial government. projects sometimes don't work out. So they have sometimes projects that they decide they're not proceeding with. The resources stay with them, and then it takes them time to come back with additional projects. So I would agree with you. Like it's there's an intention. Most of these projects are done over a 10-year period of time, which I think is an acknowledgement of the fact that there is some just planning challenges that happen in the life of infrastructure projects. The same thing with the Build Canada Strong Fund. Like it is a 10-year program precisely to allow for planning and execution to take place and for the resources to get done. I would say at the end of these projects or end of these programs, all of the money is spent, right? Like it's very rare to have like kind of lapses at the very end. I don't know if there are any. Michelle's, who's been around a lot longer than I have, is saying no. And so I think that's the real positive. So and I think flexibility. So if we were dogmatic and we said, sorry, you told us you were going to spend it in this in this fiscal year and you didn't do it, so now we're taking the money back. This would, I think this would create a massive problem in infrastructure planning and our ability to have those partnerships that are, as I mentioned, are so critical. So that flexibility that we have through being able to, carry forward money, reprofile money forward, is really, I think, central to our, the ability of ourselves working with our partners to deliver major infrastructure projects.
Thank you.
That's my time.
Yes, that is your time. Okay. And for
2.5 minutes.
Mr. Lemire.
Merci à nouveau.
Thank you once again, Madam Chair. Now I hear from your answer that it's not your fault. It's the fault of a number of other factors if the money is reprofiled. Nothing justifies additional money received. Well, nothing says that it will be spent later. When we look at the numbers, we see it's not the case. And agreements aren't public. If it's not your fault, whose fault is it? How are your relations with the government of Quebec? Because what we see is that year after year, it's difficult to reach an agreement with the government of Quebec, it would seem. But that should be an exclusive jurisdiction of the provinces. Quebec is in touch with the regions and municipalities. Municipalities are creatures of the government of Quebec. They're familiar with the reality on the ground. The federal government obstructs things in Quebec, but that doesn't appear in Ontario. Why?
Merci pour le.
Thank you for the question.
I would say we have very good relationships with the province of Quebec, and we've been, as I noted, very successful on getting a CHIF, a CHIF agreement done with the province just quite recently. That was very positive, and I also note the work that's been undertaken with Build Canada Homes. So I would say there's nothing exclusive or specifically challenging about Quebec. When we're doing agreements, we.
Je vous arrête là-dessus. Comment on peut savoir que cette.
I'll stop you on that. How do we know that that agreement is constructive if it's not public? How can we know that in Abitibi-Témiscamingue, I'll be able to help people move in like the buffer zone if the amount isn't made public? If I'm talking about infrastructure, we know there are $3 billion worth of requests for sport infrastructure in Quebec, and a program for $300 million was provided by the government of Quebec, but the federal government wasn't there. How can we ensure that that money reaches Quebec within timelines that are at least compatible and reasonable compared to Ontario in comparison?
So the agreement we just did was almost $1 billion with Quebec, and that money will flow into a program that the province will run with almost very minimal. I'll use the word interference with Ottawa. Very good collaboration happened in pulling that agreement together, and I think that will result in no delays. But we do have, with every provincial government, we go through a negotiation process on this. Our agreements are made public at a point, so we will make our agreements public with each of the provincial governments. It happens once we conclude the last one. To your point around, I'm not trying to remove myself from any responsibility for it, but this is simply in terms of just the reprofiling of the money. But it is truly beyond anybody's control. I don't blame the provinces for it when it happens on their projects. Just like costs go up. So we saw we've seen on a lot of projects the costs have gone up that have resulted in renegotiations. Our usually our principal position is we don't pay for cost overruns. In practice, sometimes there's extenuating circumstances that results in those kind of discussions happening. There's descoping of projects. So there's a lot that goes into it, and we maintain very good discussions and good relationships with the province. I would note that the one under CHIF that we didn't get an agreement with was the province of Ontario. So we actually did not get an agreement with Ontario under the CHIF. So in that case, we got one with Quebec, didn't get one with Ontario.
Okay, thank you. And for the next 5 minutes, do we have somebody from the Conservatives? Or are you taking time from the Conservatives? Mr. Lemire?
We'll give the time back to the block, please.
Okay.
Merci.
Thank you, much appreciated. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking forward to next year because what we've seen in the last year with the transition, the creation of Build Canada Homes, and the confusion with CMHC, what we've experienced is a ping-pong game where the Quebec Housing Corporation was awaiting guarantees from Ottawa, and that letter, whether it comes from CMHC or Build Canada Homes, it doesn't matter. What we want is guarantees that the money will be spent. During that time, pressure was put on the shoulders of organizations on the ground. They had timelines to respect. They saw there were mortgages that needed to be taken out, but they weren't able to because the federal government didn't respect its timelines. And when questions were asked to Minister Robinson and his staff, he seemed to have no interest in responding to our questions. I wasn't able to speak with him despite repeated requests to speak to him, and they didn't take on the responsibility. So it's not CMHC, it will be up to Build Canada Homes, but then they say, oh, the fund is available, it isn't available. So what is the reality this year? What instructions were given? Could CMHC spend money this year? And with the funds they had a guarantee for? Because there are organizations like the Emerald House that received a letter in March saying they could spend money, but when they really want to act, they couldn't. They had to wait for September, but then the snow falls and we can't build. That project was saved, but there are other shelters for women who weren't able to be saved. And so where's the clarity between what's the responsibility of CMHC and Build Canada Homes? What instructions were given this year?
So a lot in the questions you just asked. I would note that, so Build Canada Homes does not have provincial allocations for resources, right? So they have a capital allocation. They are deploying that capital across the country. It is not guaranteed that any province will receive any percentage share overall of it. They will, I'm sure, look and watch and keep detailed data around where their capital allocation is coming, but how it's being spent, but it is not a pre-given at the outset that any part of the country will receive a certain amount. It's the same thing under the transit programming as well. It was based on percentages of ridership as well. It's not based on population. So where we have population as the determination for a formula.
So there are 0 users in Quebec because we've had none of the $200 million that Ontario received. We didn't receive anything for transit in the Canada Transit Fund. Would you say that there are no transit users in Quebec?
Comme j'avais dit,
as I said,
$6.5 billion for transit in Quebec since 2016, including almost $1.5 billion for the Quebec City Transit Transitway. I noted the projects, the 11 projects, $400 million for ZETF, 24 projects, $13.4 million on RTF, 92 projects, $90 million ATF. A number of those I would note on our direct delivery side are waiting for M30 approvals, and so that can be that is a distinct feature of programming in Quebec that sometimes can make it more challenging, which is why with Build Canada Homes, they have set an agreement in place both to meet regularly, to share intelligence, so that there's where they do deals with specific municipalities, the transactions can be approved more quickly. So I think I think that's how I would answer your question.
Merci. Reste que un des
Thank you. It remains that one of the major problems is, well, part of your answers today said that money could be reprofiled and carried over and that it was okay. One of the major problems is that CMHC had approved a project in last year's budget, and when it was time to spend the money, they were told there was no money. There needed to be a new fund. So then there would be Build Canada Homes, but then there were problems on the ground. Thank you for being here today. Madam Chair, I'd like to pick up on my motion tabled at the last meeting so that the committee report to the House of Commons to request that the government establish a public and independent inquiry into cost overruns on IT contracts, including Phoenix, ArriveCan, and the benefit delivery modernization. So we're talking about cost overruns of about $10 billion for those three programs. I think that would justify the setting up of an independent inquiry. So the idea of that motion is for the committee to report to the House of Commons to request that public and independent inquiry. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So, Monsieur Dutel?
Mr. Deltel, thank you very much, Madam Chair. We will support the motion from the Bloc Québécois for obvious reasons. We're talking about cost overruns of huge proportions. IT, well, is a bottomless well for some people, but there's a limit when it becomes an abyss. There's no respect of the word given or the signatures provided. There's always something at the last minute. And then it's not increases of 5 or 10%. It's doubling, tripling, quadrupling of costs. So, Madam Chair, we need to get to the bottom of this and understand what is happening in these situations. That's why there should be an inquiry. This would be part of a sad sequence from the Liberal government. There was Phoenix twice. When we were in government, our ministers had stopped the process knowing there were challenges. When the new government arrived 10 years ago, warnings were provided by the former minister who told the government not to go forward too quickly. And then in February, we don't know who, how, or when, but it seems to have just started on its own, and we know what the results were with Phoenix. Then there's ArriveCan. Our leader had called it Arrive Scam, and that was the only funny thing about it, because it was a real catastrophe financially. It went up to huge sums of money. So, Madam Chair, I'm a member for Quebec, as is the member for the Bloc Québécois. In Quebec, we've had the Seclic scandal. The car insurance company had major challenges. And Madam Chair, 2 ministers who had to step down because of this. And now today we have a government that's not taking on any responsibility on this specific point, the specific program. 85,000 seniors have directly been affected by the poor functioning, people who are the most vulnerable in our society when they're dealing with IT, and for income as well. Many of these people, this is their only income. They can't go back to work. And the Minister of Transport said that it was just a few cases and that it was going to go well. Madam Chair, that was adding insult to injury. It was totally disrespectful towards the 85,000 people suffering. So yes, we need to get to the bottom of things. We hope this inquiry, we will see the proper way of doing things in the future, because IT contracts will be continuing for the foreseeable future.
Do I have the will of the members to allow the witnesses to leave?
Madam Chair.
Okay. Point of order?
During my questioning, I kind of rushed past on to a next question, but the Mr. Haluka had said that he could get us some information in regards to the split on the road. Could I just request that be sent in writing, please?
Yes. Okay. Witnesses may be released. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
And Mr. Osborne is on the list, followed by Ms. Kuzi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not arguing the motion so much, but I think I need to just remind the committee of the number of meetings, the number of witnesses, the resources, the time of public servants and others invested into ArriveCAN and Phoenix. Under public accounts, there were 24 meetings and 90 witnesses. Under OGO, there were 23 meetings and 65 witnesses. We are still looking in public accounts at draft reports for 2024. OGO are still finalising a report on ArriveCAN, and you know, I've sat in on OGO meetings. It doesn't seem to me as though that's a priority. So while I'm not arguing the motion, I would put forward an amendment that we remove ArriveCAN and Phoenix from the motion. If an inquiry is done and they see fit to look at these, that's fine. But you know, to make them the priority of you know, the motion or an inquiry, you know, how much resources do we continue to put into these two items year over year over year?
Do we have any speakers for this amendment? Is this an amendment? Yes. Monsieur Lemire, pardon.
Mr. Lemire. Thank you, Madam Chair. In the context, the motion isn't calling for additional meetings. So we would, well, the information that would be obtained would allow us to have a report. It could be useful for the person, the judge or the commissioner who would be leading this independent inquiry. So I wouldn't take those two programs out because these are structural programs at the federal level in reducing costs for IT, and they're responsible for the mistakes and the cost overruns. And the beauty of the system is that the more they make mistakes, the more lucrative it is for them because they're hired to fix their own problems because they've created their own system, because we no longer have the expertise, we saw it at committee, in the public service to address these problems. So I would keep the three programs in the wording, and that would give more depth to the commissioner. And with QDAM, a project that was supposed to cost $1.75 million has cost $6.6 as Minister Haydu received in June, and $3.4 billion is going into the pockets of IT companies. So why was that money spent? Were the wrong instructions given when the program was created? Is it because the program was poorly designed? There's Deloitte in there. We need to shed light on that, and other firms that were hired. So I think that fully justifies setting up a public and independent inquiry. And so not being limited, and to understand the patterns of IT companies. IBM often comes up. These are very lucrative contracts. Why do mistakes keep getting repeated? In Quebec, for 20 times less money in total, we made things happen, and it's the taxpayer who ends up holding the bag. And if we care about our seniors and our living conditions, that money going to people who have the means, it's not going to the people who are the most vulnerable.
Mr. Osborne.
Thank you. You know, just to respond to Mr. Lemire, you know, and with great respect to your motion, you know, we have seen a lot of investment, a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of witnesses, a lot of meetings. The numbers that I put forward were on ArriveCAN alone. You know, the 24 meetings and 90 witnesses at this committee, and similarly with OGO. You know, are we chasing good money after bad? I'm not arguing your motion, and if IT needs to be looked at, my concern with highlighting these two as part of an inquiry on IT or looking at IT is that whoever is conducting the inquiry will take it that these are the priorities. You know, there's been a lot of water under the bridge on these many mistakes fixed. If IT is still an issue, IT is the issue, and I think we need to focus on IT. I think we're distracting by having these two highlighted as part of the motion.
Okay. Anyone else speaking to the amendments? Mr. McKinnon? No? Okay. And we go back to the original list? No? Go down the amendments. That's it. Okay. All right, then I'll call a vote.
Mr. McKinnon? Mr. Osborne? Ms. Tesser-Dirksen? Monsieur Dantel?
Contre.
Mr. Stevenson?
Against.
Mrs. Kuzi? Against. Monsieur Lemire?
Contre.
So 3 yea, 4 nay.
Ms. Lewis, you are substituting for member? Yes. Yes.
She has to be a member. She's not subbing. Mr. Stevenson is a sub for Mr. Kirk.
Mr. Stevenson is the substitute for Mr. Kirk. Oh. For the chair. Okay, thank you. So back to the main motion, and Ms. Kuzi, you have the floor.
Yeah, I would like to thank my colleague for bringing this motion forward. As I indicated to the finance minister who was here at our last meeting, this government has a spending problem, and when we have a government that spends too much, it's passed on to the taxpayer and to Canadian citizens. And I think, of course, the best way to eliminate this spending problem is to evaluate how this government is overspending, and a way we have seen this time and time again is with projects specifically as well as consultants. I just brought up today the example of the $62 million increase at HIACC between the two fiscal years. So I think all of these three examples are very relevant. They are good examples from which we can learn. If we look at Phoenix, it's 10 years after the launch of Phoenix, and it's still failing on a regular basis to deliver paychecks properly. Since 2017, this current government has spent over $5 billion responding to Phoenix issues. However, there are still 250,000 outstanding pay issues, many for more than a year. So this is public servants who are suffering, in addition to Canadians, in terms of paying the price of these failing projects. ArriveCan, I know this issue intimately. It was an $80,000 project that ballooned to $64 million. In the House of Commons, members of Parliament have voted on this motion to get the money back, and the government, of course, has not acted, and the funds have not been recouped for this, and we need to find out why. The benefits modernization had an original cost of $1.75 billion and has now ballooned to $6.6 billion, tripling. And in January 2026, there was a backlog of 85,000 new applications, which cannot be processed as a result of this government failure. So I actually think this is an excellent motion that will touch upon the reason for this government's inability to not only deliver successful projects and successful fund reductions. And this is at a time where 2.2 million Canadians are visiting food banks. Canadians can't afford a home, and there is an $80 billion deficit. So I very much support this motion. The finance minister is aware of my concerns. I made them very clear to him at the last meeting. But we need to see some transparency from this government in terms of why they are incapable of reducing their expenditures. And I think that evaluating these three projects by an independent inquiry as to their cost overruns is a great step in that direction. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you. I would just like to raise that the analyst has mentioned a correction to the motion in English for Phoenix. It is referred to in English as Phoenix Pay System. So we will make the necessary adjustment. Measure. Mayor, yep.
The spelling was incorrect in the English version, the spelling was incorrect. So it had to be this proper spelling as well as the title. Just the spelling.
So it is not just the Phoenix Pay System as the correct term, but also the spelling of Phoenix in English will be corrected. Thank you. Are there any other speakers? Ms. Tesser Dirksen, please.
Thanks so much, Madam Chair. Sorry. Like my colleagues have said on both sides here, all sides, in principle, the motion makes sense. We don't have an issue with transparency. We don't have an issue with the public being witness to our debates or our discussions around spending. That's what this committee is here for. I'm new to the committee. I'm new to government. I'm new to Parliament. And even I can tell that the amount of resources and time and expense that has been spent on these particular issues, Phoenix or RiveCan, are excessive. And we have to answer to taxpayers. And certainly they want to know where their tax dollars are going with respect to these programs. And no one's denying that there were issues with these programs. I think it's incumbent upon us to investigate, but it's also incumbent upon us to continue to be guardians of taxpayer dollars in how we are spending resources in investigating. And in this particular instance, I don't believe the means justify the end that we're going to get. Firstly, I'm not sure what additional information is going to be found by specifically focusing on these items, Phoenix and RiveCan. I agree with Mr. Osborne that it's going to be distracting, and I wouldn't want to have this type of verbiage in the motion that would influence or direct the investigator to a particular place when there might be other things that need to be investigated. Not to say...
Point d'ordre, Madame la Présidente, cette question-là est...
Point of order, Madam Chair. This was resolved by the vote that we just held. The 3 projects are part of the motion. So I think this comment is off topic.
Je vous demanderai donc de passer.
I would ask you to move to the vote.
Point of order. I would
Yes.
observe that Mr. Lemire's comments, while the amendment was defeated, it doesn't stop the member from speaking her opinion on the motion itself.
Okay. Continue.
Point taken from my colleague there. But what I was saying is that now, well, the amendment failed, so now we have this verbiage in here. So whereas I was fully prepared to support the motion with the amendment, I'm now faced with a bit of a dilemma. I have folks who are asking about how resources are spent. And particularly with our colleagues in other committees, we're getting questions about the amount of time and resources that are being spent debating particular items. And I'm finding it very difficult to answer those questions, particularly with the incredible amount of time and resources that have been spent already on 2 of the things that are in this motion. So I hope my colleague understands where I'm coming from here. It's put, I think, all of us in a difficult situation because, again, on principle, this motion makes perfect sense. It's important to have accountability and transparency for the public to see the work that we're doing so that they understand we care. Again, this is a nonpartisan committee. I don't have a problem with IT overruns being investigated. The problem I'm going to have in supporting this is that I fear that there are going to be additional resources directed to things that have already run their course, excessively run their course. So I'm in a bit of a tough situation here. Also, with respect to the benefit modernization, I'm having trouble understanding why this keeps coming up. These are 3 very old systems which are eating up, again, valuable resources and not getting adequate results because they're aged. we're trying to replace them with the modernized system. Canadians have asked us to do this. They've asked us to modernize, to be efficient, to find efficiencies, to use their tax dollars in productive ways. We're trying to do that. We're trying to move forward a modernization program for these 3 very old benefits systems. I'm not sure where the disjointedness is there and why it's difficult for people to understand what we're trying to do. Again, I was going to say I have 2 elderly parents. My father actually died last month, so I have 1 elderly parent left. And in dealing with benefits, my mother doesn't use the computer a lot. She's not all that tech savvy. And we step in to assist, and me and my siblings. And we see gaps in those systems. We see problems with how they're used. Even us see opportunities for modernization and efficiencies, and to think that the government or that Parliament or House of Commons or our representatives wouldn't be on side with that type of modernization, and that would try to paint it in a light of being wasteful or misguided is disappointing. So, Madam Chair, I'm afraid I'm not sure I'm going to be able to support this motion, which troubles me greatly because I agree with the concept. I agree with the principle. But I feel it's misguided, it's distracting, and unfortunately, I think it's being overly politicized. We understand that there, sorry, I don't want to eat up all the time, but
as I had...
Just a point
yes.
of order, Madam
Yes.
Speaker. I don't want to interrupt my colleague. Very interesting, and I know for a newbie it's very challenging when we do respect your position. On the other hand, it's more than 1 o'clock.
Yes.
I have to go, so I will give my vote to Madam Lewis.
Okay. As the member has mentioned, it's 1 o'clock, and I did mention that we would end the meeting at 1 p.m.
To go on.
Est-ce qu'on peut passer au vote, Madame la Présidente?
Can we move to the vote, Madam Chair?
Yes.
I have commitments as well. Can we pick this up at the next one?
Yeah, we can do that. Okay, so I will adjourn the meeting then, and we will continue on at the next meeting. Meeting adjourned.